The sand was already hot that morning, even though it was barely 9 o'clock. July 26, 1974, dawned bright and merciless over Race Point Beach in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where the Cape Cod coastline curves like a crooked finger into the Atlantic. This was the outermost edge of America, a place where land gives way to dunes that shift and reshape themselves with every storm, where beach plum and poverty grass cling to existence in the sandy soil, and where the summer tourists rarely ventured this far from town. A 12-year-old girl walked her dog along the beach that morning, as she had done countless times before. The dunes rose around her like small mountains, sculpted by wind into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Her dog, running ahead as dogs do, disappeared over a ridge. When she crested the dune to follow, she found him there, pawing at something in the sand. What she saw next would haunt her for the rest of her life. A human body, or what remained of one, lay partially buried in the dune. The sand had preserved some parts while exposing others. The summer heat had done its work. But even in that state, even decomposed as it was, certain details were impossible to miss. The woman's hands were gone, not lost to decay or scavengers, but removed, cut away. Her head was nearly severed from her body, held on by mere threads of tissue and vertebrae. Someone had tried to decapitate her and had almost succeeded. The girl ran. She ran until she found adults, until she could gasp out what she had seen, until the police arrived and cordoned off the dunes with yellow tape that snapped in the Atlantic wind. What investigators found when they examined the scene more closely would turn this discovery into one of the most perplexing mysteries in American criminal history. The woman wore blue jeans and a long-sleeved shirt. No jewelry, no wallet, no identification of any kind. Her fingers were gone, taken with her hands, eliminating the possibility of fingerprint identification. Her teeth showed extensive dental work, the kind that should have been traceable, but would lead nowhere. Someone had killed this woman with brutal efficiency and had taken deliberate steps to ensure she could never be identified. They estimated she had been dead for several weeks, maybe longer. The dunes had partially concealed her, but not entirely. She had lain there through summer nights and blazing days, while tourists swam in the ocean just beyond the dunes, while couples walked the beach at sunset, while life continued its ordinary rhythms mere yards from where she rested in her sandy grave. For nearly 50 years, she would remain nameless. She became known as the Lady of the Dunes, a title that sounds almost romantic, almost gentle, until you remember what it actually means. A murdered woman. A victim so thoroughly erased that even in death, no one could say her name. The case consumed investigators, captured national attention, spawned theories that ranged from plausible to fantastical. Some claimed they recognized her. Others were certain she was connected to organized crime, to serial killers, to conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of power. The FBI took interest. Age progression specialists created images of what she might have looked like in life. Forensic artists reconstructed her face from her skull. None of it brought her name back. Decades passed. The original investigators retired or died. The case files gathered dust, but the Lady of the Dunes remained, unnamed and unavenged. One of America's most famous unidentified victims, a woman who everyone knew about, but no one could identify. Until 2022, when new technology and old persistence finally broke through the wall of silence that had surrounded her identity for almost half a century. What they discovered would be both an answer and the beginning of an even darker set of questions, because knowing who she was would only deepen the mystery of how she ended up in those dunes, and who had so brutally stolen her life and her identity on that remote stretch of Cape Cod Beach. This is her story. The story of how she was found, how she was lost, and how, finally, she was given back her name. The summer heat of 1981 had not been kind to the body lying in the culvert beneath Interstate 40. When the maintenance crew discovered her on that August morning, the oppressive Texas heat had accelerated decomposition to a degree that would complicate every aspect of the investigation to follow. What they found was not simply a body, but a carefully staged scene that would haunt experienced investigators for decades to come. The positioning of the victim immediately struck the first responders as profoundly unsettling. She lay on her back, her body arranged with an almost tender precision, that contradicted the savage violence inflicted upon her. Beneath her head, folded with deliberate care, were her own jeans. Not crumpled, not tossed aside as one might expect in a scene of violent struggle, but folded neatly, placed just so, as though someone had wanted to provide comfort in death. The gesture was intimate, personal, the kind of thing a mother might do for a sleeping child. This single detail would become one of the most debated elements of the case, a gesture that suggested knowledge, perhaps even affection, from the person who had taken her life. Covering her torso was a Wrangler brand towel, draped across her body as if to preserve her modesty or shield her from the elements. The towel bore the distinctive logo of the popular Western wear brand, and investigators would later attempt to trace its origin, hoping it might lead them to the killer. But like so many other promising leads in this case, the towel would reveal nothing definitive. What it did reveal, however, was something about the psychology of her killer. This was not a body simply dumped and abandoned. This was a body arranged, considered, almost honored in its own disturbing way. But the care taken with the positioning stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the brutality of her injuries. Her throat had been cut with such savage force that she had been nearly decapitated. The medical examiner would later describe the wound as extending deep into the cervical vertebrae, requiring significant strength and determination. This was not a single panic slash, but a deliberate, sustained act of violence. The weapon, likely a large knife or similar bladed instrument, had been wielded with enough force to cut through muscle, tissue, and partially through bone. The attack spoke of rage, of intention, of someone who wanted to be absolutely certain she would not survive. Even more disturbing were her hands, or rather, the absence of them. Both hands had been severed and removed from the scene entirely. The cuts were crude, hacking wounds rather than precise surgical incisions, suggesting the removal served a practical rather than ritualistic purpose. To investigators, the message was clear and chilling. The killer had taken her hands to prevent identification through fingerprints. This suggested premeditation, an understanding of forensic procedures, and a desperate desire to ensure the victim remained nameless. The implication was inescapable. Someone wanted to make absolutely certain that this young woman would never be identified, that she would disappear as completely in death as she apparently had in life. The decomposition complicated everything. The August heat, trapped beneath the highway overpass and concentrated in the enclosed space of the culvert, had created conditions that accelerated the breakdown of soft tissue at an alarming rate. Initially, investigators believed they were looking at a relatively fresh crime scene, perhaps only days old. The condition of the body seemed to suggest she had been killed recently, and the first reports estimated her time of death at less than a week before discovery. This initial assessment would prove catastrophically wrong and would cost the investigation precious time. As the forensic examination continued and more sophisticated analysis was applied, a disturbing truth emerged. She had not been dead for days. She had been lying in that culvert for weeks, possibly as long as a month or more. The implications were staggering. While investigators had initially focused their efforts on recent missing persons reports and events from the past few days, the actual timeline stretched back much further. Witnesses who might have seen something suspicious had scattered. Memories had faded. Evidence had degraded. The killer had gained a significant head start, and whether through luck or planning, had benefited enormously from the decomposition that obscured the true timeline. The medical examiner's report began to sketch a portrait of the victim, even as her identity remained frustratingly unknown. She was young, likely between 14 and 18 years old, though some estimates placed her as young as 12 or as old as 20. The variation in estimates spoke to the difficulty of determining age post-mortem when so much soft tissue had been compromised. Her height was estimated at approximately 5 feet 2 inches to 5 feet 5 inches. She had been slight of build, weighing perhaps 100 to 120 pounds in life. Her hair, still partially intact, was a light brown or sandy blonde color, worn at a medium length that suggested no particularly distinctive styling. But it was her teeth that told the most intriguing and ultimately most frustrating story. When the medical examiner examined her mouth, expecting perhaps to find the typical dental neglect common in transient populations or runaways, he instead discovered extensive, expensive dental work. Her teeth had received significant orthodontic attention. There were fillings, careful restorations, evidence of regular professional care. This was not the mouth of someone from an impoverished background, or someone who had been living rough on the streets. This was the dental work that spoke of money, of family resources, of someone who had been cared for medically and dentally, in a way that suggested middle or even upper middle class origins. The dental evidence created a profound paradox that investigators struggled to reconcile. If this young woman came from a family with the resources to provide extensive dental care, where was that family now? Why had no one reported her missing? How could someone from an apparently stable, financially secure background end up murdered and mutilated in a culvert beneath a Texas highway with no one looking for her? The dental record suggested she should have been easy to identify, that somewhere there should be x-rays, treatment records, a dentist who would recognize the distinctive pattern of her dental work. Yet, as investigators began the painstaking process of reaching out to dental offices across Texas and eventually across the country, they found nothing. No one recognized her dental pattern. No one had records that matched. It was as though she had appeared fully formed, with expensive teeth, and no history. The crime scene itself offered few additional clues beyond the body and its staging. The location beneath Interstate 40 was remote enough to provide privacy, but accessible enough that the killer could have approached by vehicle without attracting attention. The culvert provided concealment from casual observation, yet it was also a location that would inevitably be discovered once maintenance workers made their rounds. This suggested the killer either didn't care about eventual discovery, or perhaps even wanted the body to be found, though not immediately. There were no obvious tire tracks preserved in the hard-packed earth. No cigarette butts or convenient bits of personal identification carelessly dropped by the killer. The scene was remarkably clean of evidence beyond the body itself. What witnesses there were offered little of substance. The highway saw regular traffic, but no one reported seeing a vehicle stopped near the culvert around the estimated time of death. No one recalled seeing a young woman matching the victim's description in the area. The transient nature of highway traffic meant that thousands of potential witnesses had passed through the area without ever realizing they might have information relevant to a murder investigation. The remote location that had made it attractive to the killer now worked against investigators, creating a void where witnesses and evidence should have been. The strange contradictions of the scene continued to perplex investigators as they worked to build a profile of what had happened. The killer had shown both careful planning in removing the hands and obscuring identity, yet had left the body in a location where discovery was inevitable. He or she had shown brutal violence in the murder itself, yet almost tender care in the positioning of the body afterward. The victim came from apparent affluence, yet no one had reported her missing. Every answer seemed to generate two new questions. Every lead dissolved into uncertainty. As news of the discovery spread through law enforcement channels, investigators began the grim process of comparing their victim to missing persons reports. But here again, they encountered frustrating dead ends. No recent reports matched her description closely enough to provide a definitive lead. As they expanded the search backward in time, acknowledging the possibility that she had been missing for longer than initially believed, the pool of potential matches grew unwieldy. Without fingerprints, with significant facial decomposition, and with dental records that matched no known database, they were left with only broad physical characteristics to guide them. Height, approximate weight, hair color. These details matched dozens, then hundreds of missing young women across the Southwest and beyond. The investigation would consume thousands of hours and pursue hundreds of leads in the months that followed. But on that August day in 1981, investigators standing in that culvert beneath Interstate 40 knew they were facing something unusual and deeply troubling. The clinical evidence told a story of violence and deliberation, but the human element, the identity and history of the young woman whose life had been so brutally ended, remained maddeningly out of reach. She had been rendered anonymous by design, transformed from a person with a name and a history into a collection of forensic details and unanswered questions. The folded jeans beneath her head and the towel covering her body suggested she had mattered to someone, perhaps even to the person who had killed her. But who that someone was remained as hidden as her name. The windswept beaches of Provincetown in the 1970s held a peculiar kind of beauty, the sort that could deceive you. During the summer months, The narrow commercial street teemed with tourists clutching saltwater taffy and sunburned shoulders, their laughter carrying across the harbor where fishing boats still bobbed against weathered docks. But come October, when the last of the season workers packed their belongings and the artist colony residents shuttered their studios for winter, an entirely different Provincetown emerged from beneath the cheerful facade. This was a place where the Atlantic wind carved secrets into the dunes, where the crash of waves could swallow screams, and where people arrived and disappeared with such frequency that no one thought to question the pattern until it was far too late. Provincetown had always existed at the edge of America, both geographically and culturally. The very tip of Cape Cod curled like a beckoning finger into the ocean, separated from the mainland by miles of scrub pine and sand. This isolation bred a certain independence of spirit that attracted those seeking refuge from conventional society. Artists discovered cheap winter rents in the fishing shacks that lined the harbor. Writers found inspiration in the stark beauty of Race Point Beach, where Henry David Thoreau himself had once walked, and declared the landscape so desolate it seemed like the edge of the world. The counterculture movement of the late 1960s and early 70s added another layer to this already complex community, drawing young people who sought freedom from the rigid social structures they'd left behind in cities and suburbs across America. But freedom and anonymity share uncomfortable borders, and Provincetown offered both in abundance. The town's economy relied on constant turnover. Summer brought an influx of seasonal workers, young men and women who took jobs washing dishes, waiting tables, cleaning hotel rooms, and operating the carnival rides at the small amusement area near the pier. They came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying backpacks and sleeping bags, willing to work for cash under the table and share cramped apartments with strangers. When summer ended, most drifted away again, following warm weather south or returning to lives they'd temporarily abandoned. No one kept careful track. No one maintained detailed records of who had arrived or when they'd left. The transient population moved like tidewater, constantly shifting, impossible to measure with any precision. This fluid population created ideal conditions for predators. A young woman could arrive in Provincetown on a Monday, find work by Tuesday, and if she vanished by Friday, her absence might not register as suspicious for weeks or even months. Roommates assumed she'd moved on to the next town. Employers figured she'd quit without notice, a common enough occurrence in the service industry. Family members back home might receive a postcard or two before communication ceased, but even that wasn't particularly alarming. After all, wasn't that the whole point of running away to Provincetown, to escape the suffocating expectations of Middle America and reinvent yourself among the dunes and artists and ocean light? The town's geography compounded this dangerous anonymity. Beyond the cluster of buildings that constituted downtown Provincetown stretched the province lands, thousands of acres of protected dunes and beach where a person could wander for hours without encountering another soul. The dunes themselves were living things, constantly reshaped by wind, capable of burying and revealing with equal indifference. Old-timers told stories of entire shacks swallowed by sand, of shipwrecks that appeared on beaches after storms only to vanish again beneath the dunes. The beaches on the ocean side faced the open Atlantic with nothing between Provincetown and Portugal but 3,000 miles of dark water. In winter, these beaches became genuinely desolate, visited only by the hardiest souls and those who preferred isolation. Race Point Beach, where the body that would become known as the Lady of the Dunes was discovered in July of 1974, epitomized this eerie remoteness. Even in summer, the beach attracted fewer visitors than the calmer bayside locations. The undertow was dangerous. The water was cold. The walk from the parking area required determination. A young girl named Leslie Metcalf was walking her dog on the morning of July 26th when she noticed what she initially thought was a discarded mannequin among the beach grass. The horror of realization came slowly, the way these things often do. Not a mannequin. A woman, dead long enough that the sun and salt air had begun their work of erasure. She'd been positioned carefully, almost ritualistically, lying on a beach towel with her head resting on folded jeans. Someone had taken care with the arrangement, even as they'd inflicted terrible violence upon her body. But the Lady of the Dunes wasn't Provincetown's only brush with unexplained death during this era. The town and the surrounding cape had developed a troubling pattern of unsolved disappearances and murders, that locals discussed in whispers but rarely addressed openly. Tourism was the lifeblood of the community, after all, and stories of missing girls and mutilated bodies weren't good for business. Yet the stories persisted, passed along in bars after the tourists had stumbled back to their hotels, shared among the year-round residents who remembered things the summer people never learned. Just months before the Lady of the Dunes was discovered, another unidentified woman's body had been found in Provincetown. The Provincetown Jane Doe, as she became known in police records, was discovered in March of 1974 along Route 6, the main highway that connected the town to the rest of Cape Cod. Unlike the Lady of the Dunes, this victim had been shot. She was young, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, with reddish-brown hair and dental work that suggested she'd received regular care. Despite these identifying features, and despite the relatively recent nature of her death, no one ever came forward to claim her. No missing persons report matched her description. She was buried in an unmarked grave after investigators exhausted their limited leads, another nameless victim of Cape Cod's darker side. The parallels between these cases were haunting. Two young women, both unidentified, both discovered within months of each other in the same small town at the tip of Cape Cod. The proximity suggested a connection, though investigators could never definitively link the murders. What seemed certain was that both women had been chosen, at least in part, because of how easy it was to dispose of a body in Provincetown. The combination of transient population, geographic isolation, and limited law enforcement resources created opportunities for violence that would have been far more difficult in conventional communities. Local legends added another dimension to the area's dark reputation. Fishermen spoke of strange lights seen over the dunes at night, phenomenon that skeptics attributed to swamp gas or reflection from the lighthouse, but others insisted had more sinister origins. The peaked hill bar's life-saving station, abandoned since the 1940s, stood as a skeletal reminder of the countless ships that had wrecked along this treacherous coastline. Some claimed the area was cursed, that the spirits of drowned sailors wandered the beaches seeking company or revenge. The Wampanoag people, who had lived on Cape Cod for thousands of years before European settlement, had their own stories about certain places in the dunes that should be avoided, locations where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead grew dangerously thin. Whether one believed in curses or not, the physical reality of Provincetown's landscape created undeniable opportunities for those with dark intentions. A killer could drive to any number of remote locations, dispose of a body, and return to town within an hour. The chances of being observed were minimal, especially in the off-season. Even if someone did happen to witness suspicious activity, the culture of live and let live that permeated Provincetown discouraged the kind of nosy interference common in more conventional communities. People came to Provincetown precisely because they wanted to escape judgment and surveillance. That freedom carried a price. The artist colony aspect of Provincetown added yet another layer of complexity. The town had been attracting painters, writers, and theater people since the early 1900s, when the Provincetown Players gave Eugene O'Neill his first stage productions. By the 1970s, this bohemian tradition was well established, creating a community that valued creativity and self-expression above conformity. This was largely positive, fostering an environment where LGBTQ individuals could live openly decades before such acceptance became common elsewhere in America. But the emphasis on artistic temperament and unconventional behavior also meant that eccentricity, even disturbing eccentricity, might be overlooked or rationalized as creative expression. As summer turned to fall in 1974, with the Lady of the Dunes still unidentified and the earlier Jane Doe case growing cold, Provincetown continued its annual transformation from bustling resort to isolated outpost. The tourists departed. The summer workers scattered to other destinations. The year-round population, never more than a few thousand souls, settled in for another winter of howling winds and gray seas. Somewhere among them might have been a killer, someone who understood exactly how the town's dual nature could be exploited. Someone who knew that in a place where everyone was running from something, the perfect predator could hide in plain sight. The body had a face, but no name. For investigators standing in that sandy grave in the dunes of Provincetown on that July day in 1974, this paradox would define the next 4 decades of their professional lives. Here was a young woman with distinctive features, with dental work that spoke of money and care, with hands that had never known hard labor. She should have been easy to identify. Someone should have been looking for her. Someone should have recognized her face. But nobody did. The first composite sketch came within weeks of the discovery. The artist worked carefully with the measurements taken at the scene, trying to translate the reality of death back into the appearance of life. They gave her soft eyes and a gentle expression, hoping that somewhere, someone would see their daughter, their sister, their friend in those penciled lines. The sketch appeared in newspapers across Massachusetts, then Rhode Island, then up and down the entire eastern seaboard. Tips flooded in at first, that initial surge of public attention that comes with any mystery. Each call was logged, each lead followed to its inevitable conclusion. No, this missing daughter had been found alive in California. No, that runaway sister had different dental records. No, the timeline didn't match. The investigators learned to live with disappointment. Detective Mary Ann Town joined the Massachusetts State Police in 1979, 5 years after the body was found. The case file was already thick by then, already heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. She remembers the first time she opened it, how the photographs made her chest tighten. This wasn't just a body anymore. This was her responsibility, her burden to carry. Town made a promise to the Jane Doe that day, a silent vow that she would not stop looking until the woman had her name back. It was a promise that would consume the next 30 years of her life. By the early 1980s, forensic facial reconstruction had emerged as a new tool in the investigator's arsenal. The process was painstaking, almost artistic in its attention to detail. Specialists would take measurements of the skull, calculating the depth of tissue that would have covered each point based on the victim's age, sex, and build. Clay would be carefully applied, layer by layer, building up the muscles and skin that had long since returned to dust. Glass eyes would be set into empty sockets. A wig would be selected, styled to match what evidence suggested about her hair. The first 3-dimensional reconstruction of the Provincetown victim was completed in 1983. The sculptor had given her a serene expression, shoulder-length hair, the hint of a smile. She looked real enough to speak, real enough to tell them her name. The reconstruction was photographed from every angle, and the images were distributed widely. They appeared on the evening news, in true crime magazines, on bulletin boards in police stations from Maine to Florida. The phone rang again. More tips, more leads, more families hoping and dreading, in equal measure, that this might be their missing loved one. But the DNA never matched. The dental records were always different. The timelines refused to align. Each false identification carried its own particular cruelty. There was the family from Connecticut who were certain the reconstruction looked exactly like their daughter, missing since 1973. They traveled to Massachusetts, brought photographs, shared memories. The resemblance was indeed striking. But their daughter had different teeth, different bone structure. The family left devastated, still searching, and the investigators added another file to their growing collection of almosts and not quites. Then came the Whitey Bulger connection, and suddenly the case exploded into something much larger and more sinister. James Joseph Bulger Jr., known to everyone as Whitey, was a notorious crime boss who controlled much of the organized crime activity in South Boston during the 1970s and 80s. His gang was responsible for at least 19 murders that authorities knew about, though many suspected the true number was far higher. When investigators began looking into Bulger's activities more closely in the late 1990s, disturbing patterns emerged. Women who had associations with gang members tended to disappear. Bodies turned up in unexpected places. And the timeline of the Provincetown victim's death coincided perfectly with the height of Bulger's power. The theory gained traction quickly. Perhaps this young woman had witnessed something she shouldn't have. Perhaps she had been involved with the wrong person. Perhaps she had made the fatal mistake of crossing Whitey Bulger or one of his associates. Provincetown would have been an ideal dumping ground, remote enough to delay discovery, transient enough that a stranger wouldn't be noticed. The investigators dug deep into this angle, interviewing former gang members, following paper trails of long-ago crimes, connecting dots that seemed to form a damning picture. But once again, the truth remained elusive. No former gang members recognized the reconstructions. No financial records connected any known associates to the victim. The dental work, that expensive and distinctive dental work, didn't match the profile of women typically associated with Bulger's criminal network. This woman had come from money, from stability, from a world far removed from the violence of South Boston's underworld. The Bulger lead joined the growing pile of theories that couldn't quite be proven or disproven. In 2002, advances in forensic art led to a new reconstruction, this one created using computer modeling and the latest understanding of facial tissue depth. The artist used different assumptions this time, gave her a different hairstyle, a slightly different expression. Maybe the previous reconstructions had been too soft, too gentle. Maybe she had been harder, more defiant. The new images showed a woman with stronger features, with eyes that looked directly at the camera with something approaching challenge. Still, nobody recognized her. Detective Town, now a sergeant, kept a copy of every reconstruction in her office. She would look at them sometimes, these different versions of the same woman, and wonder which one was closest to the truth. Had she smiled easily, or rarely? Had her hair been long or short, straight or curled? Did she laugh loudly, or speak softly? The physical evidence could tell them so much about how she died, but almost nothing about how she had lived. The witness reports from Provincetown added another layer of mystery and frustration. Several people came forward after the body was discovered, saying they remembered seeing a young woman matching the victim's description in town during the days before her estimated death. She had been with a man, they said, someone in his 30s with dark hair. They had been seen together at a restaurant, walking along Commercial Street, sitting on a bench near the water. The witnesses described the woman as seeming anxious, possibly afraid. The man had been attentive, perhaps too attentive, his hand frequently on her arm or shoulder. These sightings seemed credible, seemed important. But without a name, or any way to identify the man, they led nowhere. Investigators created composite sketches of the possible companion, distributed them alongside the victim's reconstruction. No one came forward. The man, if he existed, if he was indeed connected to the murder, vanished as completely as the victim's identity. The frustration became a physical thing, a weight that settled on the shoulders of everyone who worked the case. Detective Town described it as a constant ache, a background noise of failure that never quite went away. She attended conferences on forensic identification, networked with other departments, checked and rechecked missing persons databases that grew more comprehensive with each passing year. The national database of missing persons expanded dramatically through the 1990s and 2000s, making it theoretically easier to match unidentified remains with open cases. Theoretically. In practice, the Provincetown victim matched no one. Her DNA was run against hundreds of missing persons cases from across the country. Advanced forensic genealogy techniques became available in the 2000s, offering new hope. Her distinctive dental work was compared against records from dentists in every state. Someone had paid for those perfect teeth. Someone had sat in a waiting room while she had them worked on. But dental records, investigators learned, are only useful if you have something to compare them against. Without a name, without even a region to narrow the search, they were simply another beautiful dead end. By 2009, the case had spanned 35 years. An entire generation had been born, grown up, and started careers in the time since this woman's body had been left in the dunes. The original investigators had retired. Some had died. Detective Town herself was approaching retirement, facing the very real possibility that she would leave the force with her promise unfulfilled, with this woman still nameless and forgotten. The emotional toll on the investigators cannot be overstated. These were professionals trained to solve crimes, to bring closure to families, to ensure that justice was served. The Provincetown case represented a complete failure of the systems they had dedicated their lives to. It haunted them in quiet moments, invaded their dreams, made them question their competence and their worth. Town spoke in interviews about the guilt she felt, the sense that she had somehow let this woman down, that if she had just been smarter, more persistent, more lucky, the name would have been found. Other investigators echoed her sentiments. They described becoming obsessed with the case, unable to let it go even when other priorities demanded their attention. They talked about the frustration of having so much evidence, so many clues, yet being unable to assemble them into a coherent answer. The victim wasn't some Jane Doe pulled from a river, with no identifying features. She had a face, a body type, distinctive characteristics. She had that expensive dental work, those hands that had never done manual labor, those pierced ears and painted nails. She had clearly been loved by someone, cared for by someone. How could such a person simply vanish without anyone noticing? The theories multiplied as the years passed. Perhaps she was a runaway from a wealthy family, too ashamed to report her missing. Perhaps she was involved in something illegal that made her family reluctant to come forward. Perhaps she was from another country, a tourist whose disappearance was reported to authorities that never made the connection. Perhaps she had been estranged from her family, living under an assumed name, existing in the margins where official records didn't reach. Each theory seemed plausible until it was examined closely, until it collapsed under the weight of evidence that didn't quite fit. The case became a symbol within law enforcement circles, a cautionary tale about the limits of forensic science and traditional detective work. It was used in training sessions as an example of how a case could have everything going for it and still remain unsolved. The Provincetown victim had been found quickly, before the elements could destroy too much evidence. She had been carefully examined, thoroughly documented, professionally analyzed. Every available technology had been applied to her case. Every lead had been followed, every tip investigated, every possible connection explored. And yet, for decades, she remained a ghost, a woman without a past, without a name, without anyone to mourn her properly. As the case entered its fifth decade unsolved, hope began to fade among even the most dedicated investigators. The files were still maintained, the evidence still preserved, but the active investigation had slowed to a crawl. There were simply no more leads to follow, no more traditional avenues to explore. The composite sketches, the facial reconstructions, the DNA databases, the dental records, all had failed to provide the answer that seemed like it should be so simple. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why, after all these years, did no one seem to be looking for her? Unsolved. For decades, the Lady of the Dunes remained frozen in time, her identity locked away behind a composite sketch and the cold facts of a brutal murder. The case had gone quiet, relegated to the dusty shelves of unsolved mysteries, visited occasionally by dedicated investigators, but largely forgotten by the broader public. Then, in the age of the internet, something remarkable happened. A theory emerged from the digital depths that seemed so improbable, so cinematic in its implications, that it captured imaginations around the world. The victim, some believed, might have appeared as an extra in one of the most famous films ever made. The theory began simply enough. Someone, somewhere in the vast network of amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts, was rewatching Jaws. The 1975 summer blockbuster directed by Steven Spielberg had been filmed on Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts during the summer of 1974. Just weeks, or possibly months before the Lady of the Dunes met her death in Provincetown. As this anonymous viewer watched the beach scenes, something caught their attention. In the background, among the dozens of extras milling about on the sand, was a woman. She had long dark hair. Her facial features, the shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, seemed to match the composite sketches that had circulated for years in connection with the murder case. The observation was posted online, likely in one of the many forums dedicated to cold cases and unsolved mysteries. It might have died there, dismissed as pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But instead, it spread. Other people began freezing their copies of Jaws, scrutinizing the crowd scenes, zooming in on faces that flickered by in fractions of a second. The more they looked, the more convinced some became. The resemblance was striking. Could it really be her? The theory gained momentum as internet detectives assembled their evidence. They created side-by-side comparisons, placing screenshots from the film next to the composite sketches. They enhanced images, adjusted contrast, circled features they believed matched. The woman in Jaws appeared in multiple shots during the famous beach panic sequence, when moviegoers abandoned the sand in terror after a shark attack. She was visible, if briefly, her face turned toward the camera at certain angles. For those who wanted to believe, the similarities were too significant to ignore. What made the theory particularly tantalizing was the geography and the timeline. Martha's Vineyard sits just across the water from Cape Cod. Provincetown, where the body was discovered, lies at the very tip of the Cape. These locations are intimately connected, part of the same coastal ecosystem of Massachusetts. Ferries run regularly between the islands and the mainland. During the summer of 1974, Martha's Vineyard would have been buzzing with activity as one of Hollywood's most ambitious productions transformed the quiet island into a movie set. Hundreds of locals were hired as extras. Many more simply showed up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the filming or perhaps get lucky and appear in the background of a shot. The timeline seemed to work, at least on the surface. Filming for Jaws began in May of 1974 and stretched through the summer, plagued by the now legendary mechanical problems with the shark and complicated by shooting on open water. The production wrapped in September of that year. The Lady of the Dunes was estimated to have been killed sometime between late July and early August of 1974, though the decomposition of her remains made precise dating impossible. She could have been killed as late as mid-August. If the woman in Jaws really was the victim, it meant she had been alive and in Massachusetts during the filming, just days or weeks before her murder. She might have been on Martha's Vineyard in June or July, then somehow made her way to Provincetown shortly afterward. The implications sent imaginations racing. Perhaps she had come to Massachusetts specifically because of the film production, drawn like so many others by the allure of Hollywood invading New England. Maybe she was a drifter, moving along the coast, picking up work where she could find it. Being an extra in a movie would have required no special skills or connections, just being in the right place at the right time and willing to spend hours on a beach for a small payment. It would fit with the transient theory that investigators had long considered, the idea that she was passing through the area without leaving a paper trail. Or perhaps she had traveled to the region with someone else, someone connected to the film production. The crew of Jaws included hundreds of people, cast and crew members from Los Angeles and New York, locals hired for specific skills, technicians, assistants, hangers-on. The production had essentially taken over the vineyard that summer. If the victim had been romantically involved with someone working on the film or traveling with them, it might explain both her presence in the area and the lack of anyone reporting her missing. Hollywood relationships could be transient, casual. Someone might have known her only by a nickname, or for just a few weeks. The internet sleuths dug deeper, trying to find records of extras hired for Jaws. They contacted people who had been on Martha's Vineyard during the filming, hoping someone might remember a young woman matching the description. They examined every frame of the beach scenes with obsessive attention to detail, creating timelines of when each crowd sequence was filmed. Some even traveled to Martha's Vineyard, walking the beaches where Spielberg had shot, as if the locations themselves might yield clues 4 decades later. The theory took on a life of its own, discussed on true crime podcasts, featured in online articles, debated in Reddit threads that stretched into hundreds of comments. For a case that had languished in obscurity for so long, the Jaws connection brought unprecedented attention. It appealed to multiple interests simultaneously. True crime enthusiasts saw a potential breakthrough in a cold case. Film buffs were fascinated by the idea that one of cinema's most iconic movies might contain an accidental memorial to a murder victim. The intersection of Hollywood glamour and violent death created an irresistible narrative. But as the theory spread, so did skepticism. Law enforcement officials investigating the case were aware of the speculation, and they were notably cautious in their responses. The Massachusetts State Police, who had jurisdiction over the case, acknowledged that they had looked into the Jaws connection. They had examined the footage, just as the internet detectives had. Their conclusion was decidedly less enthusiastic. The quality of the film footage from the crowd scenes was simply not sufficient to make a definitive identification. The woman in question appeared at a distance, her face partially obscured, visible only in brief flashes. Comparing these low-resolution images to composite sketches, which themselves are interpretations rather than photographs, was an exercise in ambiguity. Forensic experts pointed out the limitations. Composite sketches, even well-executed ones, are approximations based on descriptions from witnesses or, in this case, reconstructions based on skeletal remains. They capture general features but are not photographic in their accuracy. Two different artists might produce noticeably different composites from the same information. Comparing a composite sketch to a blurry figure in a film and declaring a match was scientifically dubious. The human brain is remarkably good at finding similarities between faces when it wants to. We see our friends in strangers, recognize celebrities in random passers-by. The power of suggestion is enormous. Once someone points out a resemblance, it becomes difficult to unsee it, even if the objective evidence is weak. Moreover, the woman in the Jaws footage was not unique. There were dozens of women visible in the beach scenes, many with long dark hair, many with similar builds and coloring. The 1970s aesthetic meant certain hairstyles and looks were common. Without additional evidence beyond the visual similarity, which was itself questionable, the theory remained purely speculative. No records had been found placing the Lady of the Dunes on Martha's Vineyard. No one from the production had come forward with memories of someone matching her description, who later disappeared. Still, investigators could not completely dismiss the possibility. The timeline did work. The proximity was undeniable. Stranger coincidences have proven true in other cases. The state police reportedly made efforts to obtain records from the Jaws production, seeking lists of extras, payment records, any documentation that might have captured names and addresses of the people who appeared in those beach scenes. But the film had been made decades earlier by a production company that had since gone through multiple corporate transformations. Record-keeping in 1974 was not what it would become in the digital age. Many documents had been lost or destroyed. What records did survive often contained incomplete information. Extras might have been paid in cash, their names recorded only on call sheets that no longer existed. The Jaws theory ultimately illustrated both the promise and the peril of internet investigation. On one hand, the crowdsourcing of cold case analysis had brought fresh eyes to a forgotten mystery. The attention generated by the theory meant more people became aware of the Lady of the Dunes case, increasing the chances that someone, somewhere, might recognize her or have information. Online communities had solved cases before by noticing details professionals had missed, by connecting disparate pieces of information across different jurisdictions, by simply refusing to let a case be forgotten. On the other hand, the theory showed how speculation can outpace evidence, how a compelling narrative can take on the appearance of truth through repetition and enthusiasm alone. The desire for answers, especially in a case as haunting as this one, can lead to seeing connections that are not really there. The Jaws theory was attractive precisely because it was cinematic, because it added another layer of drama to an already dramatic story. But attractiveness is not the same as accuracy. What the theory undeniably revealed was how desperate the search for answers had become. For a case to generate this level of attention from a speculative connection to a film background shot showed just how little concrete information existed. The Lady of the Dunes had been dead for over 40 years. Despite the efforts of investigators, despite advances in forensic technology, despite the attention of the public, she remained nameless. People were grasping at shadows because shadows were all that remained. The theory, whether valid or not, was a symptom of frustration, of the human need to solve mysteries, to put names to the nameless, to find meaning in tragedy. In the end, the woman in Jaws might be just another extra. Her brief moment on film entirely unconnected to the horror in the dunes. Or she might be the victim herself, frozen forever in a movie she would never see. Her last days spent on a beach that would become immortal for entirely different reasons. The truth remained elusive, floating somewhere between fact and speculation, between evidence and imagination. For 48 years she lay in that grave, marked only by a number. 4.8 decades of scientific analysis, investigative dead ends, and growing frustration. The Lady of the Dunes had become more than an unsolved case. She had become an obsession, a mystery that seemed destined to remain forever in shadow. But in 2022, everything changed. The breakthrough came not from traditional detective work, not from a confession or a discovered witness, but from a technology that hadn't even existed when this woman died on that beach in Provincetown. Genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique that finally unmasked the Golden State Killer after decades of terror, was about to give the Lady of the Dunes her name back. The journey to this moment had been long and frustrating. DNA had been extracted from the victim's remains years earlier, back in 2001, and entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system. For years, investigators waited for a match that never came. The DNA sat in databases, a digital fingerprint searching for its twin, but the killer, the victim's family, anyone who might provide answers, remained invisible to the system. Then came the advancement. Forensic genetic genealogy emerged as a game-changing tool, transforming cold cases across America.ia. The principle was elegant in its simplicity, but revolutionary in its application. Instead of waiting for an exact DNA match from a criminal database or a missing person, investigators could now use commercial genealogy databases to find distant relatives, people who shared portions of DNA with the victim or suspect. From there, geneticists and genealogists could build family trees, working backward through generations, following branches until they converged on a specific individual. In late 2021, the FBI made the decision to bring in the specialists. They partnered with Othram Labs, a Texas-based company that had made headlines for solving seemingly impossible cases. Othram specialized in forensic-grade genome sequencing, capable of extracting usable genetic data from the most degraded, compromised samples imaginable. Samples that other labs had deemed too damaged, too contaminated, too old. The Lady of the Dunes presented exactly that kind of challenge. Her remains had been exposed to the elements for days before discovery. They had been buried, exhumed for testing, reburied, exhumed again. Nearly 5 decades had passed since her death. The biological samples that remained were far from pristine. But Othram had succeeded with worse. The process began with the painstaking extraction of whatever genetic material could be recovered. Scientists at Othram worked with microscopic samples, using cutting-edge sequencing technology to read the genetic code letter by letter, even when that code was fragmented and degraded. Where traditional DNA analysis might give up, declaring a sample too compromised, Othram's proprietary methods could piece together enough information to create a usable profile. It took months. The work was meticulous, technical, requiring both advanced technology and human expertise. Each step had to be carefully documented, each result verified. This wasn't just about solving a mystery. Any identification would have to stand up to the most rigorous scientific scrutiny. Families deserved certainty, not speculation. By early 2022, Othram had succeeded in developing a genealogical profile from the victim's DNA. The genetic data was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where millions of people had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA results, hoping to find relatives, trace their ancestry, explore their heritage. Most of them had no idea their genetic information might one day help solve a murder. The database returned matches. Not close matches, not parents or siblings, but distant cousins, people who shared common ancestors with the Lady of the Dunes several generations back. To the untrained eye, these matches might have seemed unhelpful, too remote to be useful. But to genetic genealogists, they were gold. This is where the real detective work began. Investigative genetic genealogists, specialists who combine DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research, took over. They began with the DNA matches and started building family trees, massive, sprawling diagrams that reach back through the 18th and 19th centuries. Birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, all of it was fair game. They were constructing a map of family connections, looking for the point where all these distant cousins' family lines intersected. The genealogists worked backwards through time, identifying common ancestors, then working forward again, following each branch of each family tree through subsequent generation. Who married whom? Where did they live? How many children did they have? What happened to those children? Did they have children of their own? Every question led to more questions, every answer to more research. It was exhaustive, painstaking work. A single family tree might contain hundreds or even thousands of individuals. Multiple trees had to be constructed and compared, looking for overlap, for the crucial connection that would narrow the field of possibilities. The genealogists spent countless hours in online databases, in digital archives, piecing together lives lived decades or centuries ago, all to find one woman who died in 1974. Slowly, the possibilities narrowed. Certain branches of the family trees were eliminated. Wrong geography, wrong age range, wrong physical characteristics. The genealogists were looking for a woman who would have been in her mid to late 30s in 1974, who had some connection to the northeastern United States, who matched the physical description. Red hair, green eyes, distinctive dental work. Then came the moment every investigator dreams of. The family trees converged. After following dozens of branches through generations of births, deaths, marriages, and migrations, within those families, they found a woman who fit the profile perfectly. A woman who had been reported missing. A woman who had last been seen in the Boston area in the summer of 1974. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. The investigators felt that electric jolt of recognition, that sense that after nearly 5 decades, they were finally looking at the truth. But feeling certain and proving certain were two different things. They needed verification. They needed to be absolutely sure before they contacted a family that had spent 48 years searching for answers. The next step was obtaining DNA samples from Ruth Marie Terry's living relatives. This required delicate communication, approaching family members who had no idea why the FBI might suddenly be interested in their missing loved one. The relatives provided samples willingly, desperately hoping for closure after decades of uncertainty. The comparison was conducted with rigorous scientific standards. The DNA from Ruth Marie Terry's relatives was analyzed and compared to the DNA from the Lady of the Dunes. The scientists looked for the specific markers that would confirm a familial relationship, the genetic signatures that could only come from shared ancestry. The results came back positive. Not just positive, but conclusive. The mathematical probability that this was anyone other than Ruth Marie Terry was infinitesimally small. After 48 years, the Lady of the Dunes had her identity back. Ruth Marie Terry had been 37 years old when she died. She had been born in Tennessee, the daughter of a mining family, one of 12 siblings. She had lived a hard life, marked by struggles and setbacks, by bad relationships and broken promises. By the early 1970s, she had made her way to the Boston area, far from her Tennessee roots, trying to start over, trying to find something better. Her family had reported her missing in 1974. They had searched for her, filed reports, made inquiries. For years, they wondered what had happened to their daughter, their sister. Had she simply chosen to disappear, to cut ties and start fresh somewhere new? Had something terrible happened to her? The questions haunted them through the decades, unanswered and unanswerable. They never knew that she was the famous unidentified victim they might have read about in newspapers or seen on television. They never knew that she lay in a grave in Massachusetts, her death the subject of countless articles, documentaries, and investigations. The Lady of the Dunes had been famous, but Ruth Marie Terry had been forgotten, her name lost while her mystery consumed the public imagination. The revelation was heartbreaking. The family had spent nearly 50 years in limbo, not knowing if Ruth was alive or dead, if she had abandoned them or been taken from them. Now they knew the truth, and with that truth came a grief that had been suspended for decades. They could finally mourn properly, finally lay her memory to rest with dignity and acknowledgement. But the identification, as momentous as it was, answered only one question. It gave Ruth Marie Terry her name back, restored her identity, reconnected her to the family that had never stopped searching. Yet the larger mystery remained. Who killed Ruth Marie Terry? Why was she on that beach in Provincetown? What brought her to that isolated stretch of sand where someone murdered her with brutal violence? The breakthrough had transformed the case from an impossible mystery to a solvable crime. Now investigators had a starting point, a real person with a real history, connections, relationships, enemies perhaps. They could trace her movements in the months and weeks before her death. They could look for people who knew her, who might have information about what happened in those final days of her life. The same genetic genealogy techniques that identified Ruth Marie Terry could potentially identify her killer if usable DNA had been preserved from the crime scene, if the killer's relatives had uploaded their DNA to genealogy databases. The technology that had given her back her name might yet bring justice for her death. For the investigators who had worked on this case for years or even decades, the identification was vindication and renewal. Their persistence had been rewarded. The impossible had become possible. And for the family of Ruth Marie Terry, there was finally an end to the uncertainty. a chance to bring their loved one home, to mark her grave with her true name, to remember her not as a mystery, but as a person who had lived and loved, and deserved to be remembered. Ruth Marie Terry never imagined her life would end at 32 in a cold Boston area cemetery, her body left to be discovered among the gravestones like discarded refuse. But to understand how she arrived at that terrible fate, we must first know Ruth as she truly was, a woman with dreams and fears, a past that shaped her, and a future that was stolen. Ruth Marie grew up in the hills of Tennessee during the 1940s and 50s, in a world far removed from the urban sprawl of New England, where she would eventually meet her end. She was born into modest circumstances, the kind of small-town southern upbringing where everyone knew everyone, where front porches served as gathering places on humid summer evenings, and where a young woman's options often felt predetermined by geography and circumstance. Those who knew Ruth in her Tennessee years remembered a woman searching for something more than what her hometown could offer. She possessed a restlessness, a desire to experience life beyond the familiar boundaries of her youth. This wanderlust, this yearning for possibility, would eventually lead her north toward what she hoped would be a better life. Instead, it led her directly into the path of a monster. By 1974, Ruth had established herself in the Boston area, working as a secretary, navigating the challenges of single life in a city that could be both exciting and unforgiving. She lived modestly, maintained friendships, showed up for work reliably. In every measurable way, she was building a life. She was not wealthy, not famous, not someone whose disappearance would make immediate headlines. She was simply Ruth, a woman trying to make her way in the world, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes her story so devastating. This could have been anyone's sister, anyone's daughter, anyone's friend. Then Guy Rockwell Muldavin entered her life. Guy Muldavin was 67 years old when he met Ruth, a man who had lived through decades that left a trail of suspicion and death in his wake. To understand the true horror of what happened to Ruth Marie Terry, you must first understand the pattern that preceded her. A pattern so disturbing that it strains credibility, yet every detail is documented, investigated, and tragically real. Let us travel back to Seattle, Washington, in the year 1960. Guy Muldavin was married then to a woman named Manzanita, his second wife. They lived together with Manzanita's 18-year-old daughter from a previous relationship, a young woman named Dolores. On a September day that year, neighbors noticed an absence, a silence where there should have been activity. When authorities finally entered the Muldavin home, they discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. Both Manzanita and Dolores were dead, their bodies found in the bathroom, both having suffered fatal head injuries. The brutality of the scene suggested rage, intimate violence, the kind of killing that happens when someone close crosses a final, terrible line. Guy Muldavin immediately became the focus of the investigation. How could he not? A wife and stepdaughter found bludgeoned to death in their own home, and he was the only other person with access, the only other person who lived in that space. Detectives interviewed him extensively. They documented his inconsistent statements, his suspicious behavior in the days following the deaths, his apparent lack of genuine grief. The evidence pointed in one direction, yet it remained circumstantial, just beyond the threshold needed for prosecution in that era. Despite their suspicions, despite their certainty that they knew who had committed these murders, authorities never filed charges. Guy Muldavin walked free. Think about that for a moment. 2 women dead under the most suspicious circumstances imaginable, and the prime suspect simply continued living his life. But Guy Muldavin did not stay in Seattle. He could not with the weight of suspicion following him, not with neighbors who whispered and investigators who never quite closed the book on those deaths. He moved, as people with terrible secrets often do, seeking fresh territory where his past remained unknown, where he could reinvent himself, where new victims might not know to be afraid. Over the years that followed, Muldavin drifted through various states, various lives, various identities. He possessed a certain charisma that some people found appealing, a way of presenting himself that could be charming when he chose. He was educated, articulate when it suited him, capable of seeming respectable. This is crucial to understand. Monsters do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they wear ordinary faces, speak in measured tones, and know exactly how to make someone feel special, chosen, safe. By the time Ruth Marie Terry encountered Guy Muldavin in the early 1970s, more than a decade had passed since the Seattle murders. Whatever Ruth knew about his past, if she knew anything at all, it was not enough to warn her away. At some point in 1973 or early 74, Ruth and Guy married Dada. For Ruth, perhaps this represented hope, companionship, partnership. For Muldavin, the evidence suggests something far darker was at work. The details of their marriage remain fragmentary, obscured by time, and the fact that Ruth is no longer here to tell her own story. What we know comes from documentation, from public records, from the investigation that would eventually piece together the final days of her life. We know that by May of 1974, the marriage was already showing signs of strain. We know that Ruth had been planning to visit family, that she maintained connections to people who cared about her, that she was not completely isolated despite Muldavin's presence in her life. And we know that on or around the 27th of May, 1974, Ruth Marie Terry disappeared. When someone first goes missing, there is often a delay before alarm bells truly sound. Days pass. Maybe she went on that trip to see family. Maybe there was a misunderstanding about timing. Maybe. But as days turned into weeks, those who knew Ruth understood that something was terribly wrong. Ruth was not the type to simply vanish without explanation. She was responsible, connected, present in her own life. Then came the discovery that transformed missing person case into homicide investigation. On June 10, 1974, 2 weeks after Ruth disappeared, a groundskeeper at a cemetery in the Boston area made a horrifying find. Partially concealed near the gravestones, left among the markers of the properly dead, the properly mourned, lay Ruth Marie Terry's body. She had been murdered, her life taken with violence, her remains abandoned with a callousness that spoke to the killer's complete lack of regard for her humanity. The investigation immediately focused on Guy Muldavin. How could it not? The husband is always the first suspect, and this husband carried with him the ghost of Seattle, the memory of 2 other women found dead in their home 14 years earlier. Detectives began building their case, documenting the timeline, establishing motive and opportunity, connecting the dots between a man's violent past and his wife's murdered present. What they discovered painted a damning picture. In the days immediately following Ruth's disappearance, Muldavin exhibited behavior that can only be described as consciousness of guilt. He fled Massachusetts, moving quickly, putting distance between himself and the jurisdiction where his wife had vanished. When questioned later, his explanations proved evasive, contradictory, carefully constructed to avoid direct admission, while never quite establishing innocence. Investigators also uncovered financial motives. Ruth had assets, modest though they may have been, and Muldavin stood to benefit from her death. There were insurance policies, property considerations, the cold calculation of someone who viewed another human being as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a partner to be cherished. But most devastating of all was the pattern. 2 wives, both dead under suspicious circumstances. A stepdaughter killed alongside her mother in Seattle. And now Ruth, murdered and discarded. 3 women connected to Guy Muldavin. 3 women whose deaths followed similar trajectories of domestic proximity, sudden violence, and Muldavin's suspicious behavior in the aftermath. Yet once again, the evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial. Yes, Muldavin had motive. Yes, he had opportunity. Yes, his behavior before and after Ruth's death suggested guilt. Yes, he had a documented history connecting him to previous murders. But the physical evidence, the kind of proof that convinces juries beyond reasonable doubt, remained elusive. No witnesses had seen the actual murder. No weapon was definitively linked to both crime and suspect. The circumstantial case was powerful, but in the American justice system, powerful is not always sufficient. Authorities in Massachusetts prepared to charge Muldavin with Ruth's murder. They believed they had enough, believed they could convince a jury that this man, this husband, with a dead wife and a violent past, had killed again. But legal maneuvering, jurisdictional complications, and the passage of time worked in Muldavin's favor. The case stalled, delayed, got caught in the machinery of a legal system, that sometimes fails the very victims it is meant to protect. And Guy Muldavin remained free. Think about what that means. A man investigated for the murders of his second wife and her daughter in 1960, never charged. The same man whose third wife is found murdered in 1974, and still he walks free. For Ruth's family, for those who loved her and mourned her, the injustice must have been unbearable. Muldavin lived on for decades after Ruth's death. He moved again, because that is what he did, drifting to new locations, perhaps seeking new opportunities, perhaps simply running from the weight of his own history. He lived through the 1980s, through the 1990s, into a new century. He grew old, his body aging in ways that Ruth's never would, granted years and experiences that he had stolen from her. In 2002, Guy Rockwell Muldavin died. He was 95 years old, having lived a long life despite the trail of death that followed him. He died without ever being formally charged with Ruth Marie Terry's murder. He died without ever being held accountable for what happened in Seattle in 1960. He died, in the eyes of the law, an innocent man, though innocence and legal acquittal are not always the same thing. But death does not end all stories. In 2013, more than a decade after Muldavin's death, authorities in Seattle reopened the investigation into the 1960 murders of Manzanita and Dolores. Using modern forensic techniques, reviewing old evidence with fresh eyes, they reached a formal conclusion. Guy Rockwell Muldavin was guilty of those murders. Though he could no longer be prosecuted, no longer face trial, no longer be imprisoned, the official record now states clearly what investigators had believed all along. Guy Muldavin was a killer. This posthumous determination casts Ruth Marie Terry's death in even starker relief. If Muldavin killed his second wife and stepdaughter in 1960, and if his third wife was found murdered in 1974 under circumstances that pointed directly to him, then the pattern is not coincidence. It is methodology. It is a man who discovered that he could kill women close to him and escape consequences, so he did it again. And possibly again. We will never know with absolute certainty what happened in Ruth's final moments. We will never know if she suspected, if she tried to flee, if she fought back. We will never hear her testimony, never know her side of the story, because that was taken from her along with everything else. What we do know is that Ruth Marie Terry deserved better than the life and death she received. She deserved to grow old, to see grandchildren if she wanted them, to retire and reflect on a life well lived. She deserved justice, the kind that comes from a trial, a conviction, a sentence served. Instead, her killer lived free for 28 years after her murder, dying peacefully of old age, never once held legally accountable for the lives he destroyed. If there is a more devastating failure of justice, it is hard to imagine. Ruth Marie Terry was not just a victim. She was a daughter of Tennessee, a woman who came north seeking better things, a person with value and dignity and a future that should have been hers to live. Guy Rockwell Muldavin took all of that from her, and he was never made to answer for it while he still drew breath. That is the true horror at the heart of this story. Not just that murder happens, but that sometimes murderers win. Knowing her name was supposed to bring closure. But for the family of Ruth Marie Terry, learning what happened to the woman they had searched for since 1974 brought something far more complex than peace. It brought answers, yes, but those answers came wrapped in horror, bound with unanswered questions that may never be resolved. The Lady of the Dunes finally had her identity returned to her after nearly 50 years in an unmarked grave, but the truth of her final hours remains as elusive as the shifting sands that once covered her body. The questions that haunt this case don't simply linger, they echo. Why were Ruth's hands removed with such precision? The medical examiner determined that her hands had been severed and taken from the scene, a deliberate act that required time and determination. The most obvious explanation points toward preventing identification. Without fingerprints, without the unique whorls and patterns that mark each human being as distinct, Ruth became anonymous. For decades, this worked exactly as intended. But there's something about the methodical nature of this mutilation that suggests it might have meant more than mere practicality. Some investigators have wondered whether it carried symbolism, a message encoded in violence that we can no longer read. In certain criminal profiles, the removal of hands speaks to silencing, to taking away agency, to erasing the victim's ability to point or accuse. Was someone making sure Ruth could never identify them, even in death? Or was this brutality something more personal, more ritualistic? The near decapitation raises similar questions that refuse to rest quietly. Ruth's throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. This goes far beyond what would be necessary to kill. It speaks to rage, to overkill, to a perpetrator who didn't simply want Ruth dead, but wanted to obliterate her. Forensic psychologists often note that this level of violence directed at the neck and face suggests a personal connection, someone who needed to destroy not just the victim's life, but their identity, their very face. Yet if Guy Rockwell Muldavin killed Ruth, what was the nature of their relationship? Were they simply acquaintances who crossed paths in Provincetown that summer? Or was there something deeper, something that ignited the kind of fury that leads to this degree of savagery? The timeline of Ruth's final days remains frustratingly vague. We know she was alive in 1974. We know her body was discovered on July 26th of that year. But the days or weeks leading to her death exist in shadow. Did she know she was in danger? Did she try to leave? To escape? To call for help? Provincetown in the summer of 1974 was crowded with tourists, artists, transients passing through. Ruth could have walked past dozens of people in her final hours, and none of them would have known what was coming. This is perhaps one of the cruelest aspects of violent death, how ordinary the moments before can be. She might have watched the sunset over the harbor, eaten a meal, made small talk with strangers, all while moving unknowingly toward her end. Guy Muldavin, the man investigators now believe killed Ruth Terry, died in 2002. He took whatever secrets he held to his grave, leaving behind only circumstantial evidence and disturbing patterns of behavior. Can he be definitively proven as the killer when he's been dead for over 2 decades? The answer that families of victims hate to hear is probably not. The DNA that identified Ruth cannot connect her to Muldavin directly because we have no sample of her blood or tissue from beneath his fingernails, no physical evidence that places him at the scene. What we have instead is a web of connections. Muldavin's presence in Provincetown that summer, his known history of violence against women, the eerie similarities between Ruth's death and the suspected murders of Muldavin's previous wife. In the court of public opinion, the case feels closed. In a court of law, it would face significant challenges. This raises the uncomfortable question that true crime followers often resist. What if it wasn't Muldavin? Investigators are confident, and the circumstantial evidence is compelling, but the possibility of other suspects or scenarios hasn't been entirely ruled out. Provincetown in the 70s had its share of dangerous individuals. The area saw other unsolved murders during that era. Could Ruth have encountered someone else? Someone whose violence intersected with hers in that particular moment? The removal of her hands and the near decapitation could suggest someone with anatomical knowledge, perhaps medical training. Muldavin had no such background. Does this detail point elsewhere, or did Muldavin simply have enough determination to accomplish what he set out to do, regardless of his lack of expertise? These questions don't necessarily exonerate Muldavin, but they remind us that certainty in cold cases is often an illusion we construct because ambiguity is too uncomfortable to bear. For Ruth's family, the mixture of emotions defies simple description. Her sisters, now elderly themselves, finally know what happened to the woman who vanished from their lives 5 decades ago. There is relief in knowledge, in no longer wondering if she might still be alive somewhere, suffering from amnesia, or living under a different name. But that relief is inseparable from horror. The details of how Ruth died, the brutality inflicted upon her body, the lonely stretch of beach where she was discarded like refuse. These images now occupy the space where hope once lived. And threaded through both the relief and the horror is the bitter knowledge that there will almost certainly never be prosecutable justice. No trial, no verdict, no moment in a courtroom where Ruth's name is spoken aloud and her killer is held accountable. The man they believe murdered her escaped earthly justice entirely, dying of natural causes in a nursing home, his crimes unacknowledged and unpunished. Race Point Beach today looks much as it did in 1974. The dunes still shift with the wind, The beach grass still bends and whispers, the Atlantic still rolls its endless waves against the shore. Tourists come in summer to swim and sunbathe, often unaware that they're walking near the spot where one of America's most famous unidentified victims was found. There's no marker, no memorial plaque to indicate what happened here. But among those who follow unsolved cases, among the community of people who refuse to let the Lady of the Dunes be forgotten, Ruth Terry's name is now spoken with respect and remembrance. She is no longer just a mystery, a nameless victim defined only by the violence done to her. She is Ruth Marie Terry, a daughter, a sister, a woman who lived and loved and had dreams before someone decided to take all of that away. Yet, even with her name restored, even with a likely suspect identified, her final moments remain shrouded in shadow. We don't know what she felt, what she feared, whether she had time to understand what was happening, or whether death came as a terrible surprise. We don't know if she fought, if she pleaded, if she was given even a moment to be heard. This is the haunting reality of cases like Ruth's. Sometimes we find the name, we restore the identity, we give the family answers they've sought for decades. But the truth, the full truth of what happened and why, stays buried in the dunes, carried away on winds that have long since scattered any remaining evidence. Justice, in its fullest sense, requires not just knowing who but proving it beyond doubt, and time has made that impossible. What remains is a story of a life cut short, a killer who likely escaped consequence, and a family left to grieve not just the loss but the incompleteness of their answer. The dunes keep their secrets still, and Ruth Terry's final truth may rest there forever, just beyond our reach. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.